Everybody again, and it's wonderful to have you with us. I think we've got more that should be joining us or scheduled to join us, and just by way of a perspective here, people from Finland, there was one due from Russia on the webinar today, from Denmark, from the UK and South Africa, and fantastic to have you all with us. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we're delighted to have Niven Postma speaking to us. Niven, many of you might already know. She's certainly working as an associate of Lead with Humanity already, but in her own right is a strategic leadership and culture facilitator, strategist. Her own track record is to be envied. I mean, I always envy the fact that she spent 4 years just backpacking around the world. What a wonderful experience to have done something like that. And then after university, worked for some of the bigger consulting groups, then worked in the NGO space for NOAA, where she was a CEO, and also as head of the first founding head of the Businesswomen's Association of South Africa. Thereafter, executive roles at the SA Reserve Bank and at Standard Bank before coming back to the consulting world a few years ago. Niven, it's just wonderful to have you address us today. Thank you. Thank you for all you contribute to our network. And on a topic that's vexed in many people's minds, but I know you're going to decipher it from us, simply talking about facing up to the reality of office politics and the power of corporate cultures. So Niven, over to you, and we look forward to what you have to share with us.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be part of Lead with Humanity again. Even if it's not in Pindar or at Constitutional Hill, it's just lovely because it's a fabulous group of people. And so let's get going. To add to very, very illustrious on many levels and very enjoyable career, one of the things that I was utterly allergic to was any mention of office politics. I mean, and I really wore it as a badge of honor. You know, do me a favor. I'm not interested in that. I'm just here to do my job. I think my Dutch heritage, I'm way too straightforward to play all these ridiculous games. And so for 20 years, like I said, I thought got on with things. And then quite a bruising encounter with office politics got me not just needing to understand the subject, but getting to reflect on it and reflect on my career as well. And in that reflection, not just thinking about the things that are on LinkedIn and that my mother tells all of her friends, but the times when I really struggled and where I hit my head up against a brick wall, and what were some of the things that not only I didn't know, but I didn't know that I needed to know. And they really did center around this idea of politics and power. And so how do these fit into strategy? How do they fit into culture is part of what I'm going to start looking at with my PhD next year. So I'm sure there'll be plenty more answers to come over the next 4 or 5 years. But for now, certainly there are a few that I've put together both in a book and in articles and in lectures and masterclasses. And so get to share a few of those with you today. And so let me start with a complete cliche. And Pete, as somebody who's also worked in strategy for years and even more years than I have, I mean, please don't groan when you see this, right? Because, I mean, isn't this the absolute cliche of culture and strategy? And attributed to Peter Drucker, it gets trotted out all of the time. And then it's been added to over the years as well, that never mind culture eating strategy for breakfast, the latest is, and it eats innovation for lunch and everything else for dinner. So, I think the reason why things are cliches is because they've got a kernel of truth in them. And I would certainly agree with this kernel of truth. I had a fabulous colleague in my first role as a strategy consultant. Andreas was literally a rocket scientist. He got his aerospace engineering degree from Cambridge. And he said to me always, yeah, Niv, if you want to change the strategy, well, you change the slide. You want to change the culture, not so much. And so all of the work that I've done in strategy and culture and leadership has been around how a culture enables or disables a strategy, how it works to support a strategy, or it completely mitigates a strategy, which may make all kinds of rational, analytical, technical sense on a slide, but from a culture point of view, this strategy and this culture, they're not compatible. Currency. And not this currency, but this currency. Relationship currencies. Relationship currency. Your influence capital. Your social quotient, and how this enables you to access all manner of things, for better or for worse, through perfectly ethical means or through less than ethical means. And at the heart of this, and the heart of the relationships that you have, is also another subject that we have very single and singular stories about. Just as much as many people shy away from the idea of politics, many people, and in my experience, particularly women, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, shy away from the idea of power and the mere concept of power and the idea that we may have power or need to acquire it to be effective in who we are and what we need to do. And again, this comes from a very narrow understanding of what power is. And so I've shown you House of Cards. I mean, I simply have to show you Game of Thrones, of course. And so if you haven't watched Game of Thrones, it doesn't matter. The context is irrelevant to this clip that I'm about to show you. But if you have watched Game of Thrones, you'll know some of the context and background to the two characters. So have a look at this clip around power.
Mockingbird, you created your own schedule, didn't you?
Yes.
Appropriate for a self-made man with so many songs to sing.
I'm glad you like it. Some people are fortunate enough to be born into the right family. Others have to find their own way.
I heard a song once about a boy of modest means. Found his way into the home of a very prominent family. He loved the eldest daughter. Sadly, she had eyes for another.
When boys and girls live in the same home, awkward situations can arise. Sometimes I've heard even brothers and sisters develop certain affections. And when those affections become common knowledge, well, that is an awkward situation, indeed, especially in a prominent family. Prominent families often forget a simple truth. I found.
Which truth is that?
Knowledge is power.
Seize him. Cut his throat. Stop. Wait. I've changed my mind. Let him go. Step back 3 paces. Turn around. Close your eyes. Power. Do see if you can take some time away from your coins and your halls to locate the star gun for me. I would very much appreciate it.
Yeah, so as with politics, as with power, not all power is equal and not all power is the same. And I mean, that's, of course, a massively dramatized version, but I tend to believe very strongly in this quote from Martin Luther King, which I think says it perfectly. Power without love is reckless and abusive and all manner of other things, but love without power is sentimental and anemic. And I say that as someone who I think has tried to manage both, not only in my career, but in my life. When I was heading up an NGO that looked after orphaned and vulnerable children, and I was engaging with child-headed households living in deep rural areas of South Africa with no access to running water or electricity. I mean, they may as well have been in a parallel century, never mind a parallel country and universe. The love and care and desperate efforts we were investing in trying to improve the life of these kids could only take us so far if we didn't have institutional and organizational power to make things happen. And so often when I lecture, often with students, it's this either or again, and this aversion to the idea of power. The idea of power and love being mutually exclusive is entirely wrong. And I think part of the reason why we have some of the challenges that we have in the world today. So all of these things come together to hopefully start to give lie to this idea that you can either be a decent human being or you can play politics and seek to get power. As with many things in life, it is a both and. It has to be a both and. Second myth, it's possible to avoid politics. Well, that's simply not true. And I don't just speak from the research that I've undertaken over years for my book and for the work that I do, but from my own personal experience. Pete gave some indication of my experience, across corporate and NGOs and the public sector, and it's absolutely true. Okay, it's not whether organizations will have politics, but what kind of politics they will have. And in a full workshop, we really start to unpack what is the range of politics? What are the types of politics that you might come across in an organization? And of course, they exist on a spectrum of healthy to completely unhealthy. That's a whole other discussion. How you choose to show up and whether you want to be in what part of that spectrum, that's also another whole discussion. But the myth that you're going to escape politics, even in minimally politicized environments, is completely wrong, which sometimes breaks people's hearts because they've had this fantasy of one day they're going to find a place with no politics. And other times makes people feel like, okay, so what do I do with the politics where I am? And are they the kind of politics that I've got the stomach for? The third myth is that politics don't make a difference to your career. Well, that's also entirely wrong, and once again, wrong. They don't only make a difference to your career, they can make a difference to entire sectors, and I've seen that in some of the multi-stakeholder work that I've done. They can make a difference to an entire business and industry. And so Kathleen Kelly-Reardon, who's a professor on organizational politics, I think says it really well. It's all politics. Winning in a world where talent and hard work are not enough. Now, let's be really clear. Our definitions of winning are very different, and they should be very different. They're very personal. What does success mean to me? And let me also be really clear. We can have a long conversation, probably over a good bottle of wine, as to whether talent and hard work should be enough, and in an ideal world, that they would be enough. In this world, a world where I am certainly not a cynic, I don't wake up every day with a sense of disillusionment about the nature of the world. I wake up every day to do something that I think matters. In this world, I am also not naive. I'm much more pragmatic and realistic. And in this world, politics make the difference. And so let me give you an example of how this works. So I'm going to give you 5 seconds and a free copy of my book, which I will personally autograph and send to anybody anywhere in the world, if somebody can tell me who this is. Next, we got any takers? Going. Gone. Good. I've just saved myself about 3,000 Rand on Postnet fees if I had to send a book to Finland or somewhere exotic. Okay, so this is John Antioco. He was the CEO of Blockbuster. And I thought, until I read some work from Rita McGrath, who's a professor of strategy at Columbia Business School, I thought I knew the Blockbuster story. It's a straightforward one, right? Of hubris and market dominance and refusal from a cultural and strategic point of view to see changing inflection points in an industry. And so, you chart his career and you chart Blockbuster's fortunes, and Blockbuster's one of those classic case studies, along with Nokia, along with a number of others, of how these huge incumbents can't, won't see change coming and strategically, culturally implode. Well, that's not the whole story. And like I said, this was only something I discovered a little while ago from Rita McGrath's work. So obviously Blockbuster's fortunes and Netflix's are very firmly intertwined. So Netflix was started because of a frustration by Reed Hastings when he returned his video to Blockbusters and was charged late return fees. I think the story is pretty well known, and he thought, no, look, this is really irritating. I'm going to start something where you don't have to pay these late return fees. And the late return fees for Blockbuster were a significant part of their income. In 2001, it was estimated, and that's almost at the peak of their fortunes, $800 million of Blockbuster's income was coming from late return fees. So this was hard-baked into their business model. And so the irritation that Reed Hastings and others felt was something that they saw as a bit of an irritation to customers, but not enough of an irritation to overcome with $800 million coming in from that. Add to the story, you may have heard about how in late 2001, September, in fact, Netflix, in the wake of the dot-com crash, was really, really struggling and wasn't sure that it was actually going to be able to survive. So they went to Blockbuster and offered to put themselves up for sale. And, you know, there's all kinds of versions of the story, and none of us were in the room. But all kinds of cultural arrogance, apparently, from the part of Blockbuster. No. Why do we need to buy you? We don't need you. We don't want you. And one of the owners of Netflix said, John Antioco was wearing shoes that cost more than my car. So again, you know, let's amplify the story of corporate arrogance and dominance and hubris. Fine. So far, so good. We all think we know the story. What I didn't know until I read, like I say, some of Rita McGrath's work was that, in fact, in 2004, John Antioco had launched what he called the total access strategy. He could completely see where the industry was going according to the strategy. And so what was he going to do? At that time, you know, streaming was nascent, but at that time, Netflix had a couple of disadvantages. They couldn't immediately gratify your need for a DVD. So with the rise of DVDs, DVDs being posted by Netflix suddenly became possible. It was very different to a big bulky VHS. But they couldn't immediately get you your DVD, whereas Blockbuster had thousands of stores across the US and millions of customers. And so in terms of the total access strategy, they were going to do a couple of things that were quite radical. They were going to cut their late return fees, so scrap what's been estimated to be between 16 and 20% of their annual revenue. No more late fees. They were going to use their range of a network of stores and customers to start to get much speedier delivery. And in fact, they were launching Blockbuster online. So they were starting to enter the streaming space. And at the time, analysts were just hailing this and saying, but this is astonishing. You're going to take some short-term pain that had their share of the business by Viacom, that had been owned by Viacom, bought out. So, okay, you're going to have to reconfigure yourself, reinvent yourself quite drastically. But this total access strategy is genius. You've got a whole bunch of advantage over Netflix and others. You're going to take the short-term pain, but this makes a whole bunch of sense. Let's see where it goes. Well, where did it go? A few years later, Blockbuster was completely bankrupt. And a whole industry went, and there's one Blockbuster store left in the US in Oregon for people who want a trip down memory lane. They can go there. And so why am I telling you the story? Because from a strategy point of view, John Antioco had the right idea, and he had all the opportunity to implement it. But to add to the part of the story that we don't generally understand is that from a power point of view, from a politics point of view, he did not have the support. So enter stage left, Carl Icahn, who was an activist shareholder who had a whole bunch, it's a long story, but in short, had a whole bunch of the hedge funds behind him and was simply not prepared to watch Blockbuster launch the total access strategy, which was going to cost about $400 million in the short term. And so basically got a shareholder meeting where he took control and managed to get a whole bunch of directors of his choice onto the board. which meant that John Antioco was completely outmaneuvered. And so even when the data was coming in from stores that cutting the late return fees was proving to be profitable, Carl Icahn and the directors were not interested. And so slowly but surely a series of power moves happened such that the rationally best strategy for Blockbuster and for that industry, the strategy that had been lauded, the strategy that had been celebrated, the strategy that could have made the difference, was completely ignored and upended because of power and politics happening in a boardroom level and John Antioco not having the coalition of support that he needed. And so I tell this story because, you know, in my experience as a strategy consultant, how many times people think that the rational best answer, the best strategy is all that's needed. In fact, the gap between the rational best strategy and what's actually going to happen or be allowed to happen, well, that's power and politics. And certainly most strategy consultants don't think of that, don't have a lens to look at it. And this is precisely the kind of thing that can take the best strategy and make it go nowhere. And so taking from Rita McGrath's work, from a strategy point of view, from a culture point of view, how you look at the future, the range of futures that you can look at is one thing. And how widely and broadly you can think strategically requires all manner of skills and ways of thinking and ways of applying yourself and ways of scanning the horizon and understanding that snow melts from the edges and so too with innovation. So how do you bring in the peripheral understandings? But from my point of view, from a politics and power point of view, it's not just about being able to entertain the range of options. John Antioco entertained and had a strategy to deliver, but he couldn't deliver because he didn't have the right stakeholders on his side, or conversely, he had the one wrong stakeholder against him. And then the fourth myth is we think that this has all disappeared in virtual environments. Well, again, that's simply not true, even if our workplaces all over the world, you know, still for the most part look like this. And I have a number of clients in a number of places. And I mean, this is pretty much what they look like. I'm speaking to people all over the world and seeing their kids and their plants, and you're seeing my background and I'm seeing theirs. Very few organizations have gone back full time, but the rules that applied when we were in offices still apply now, because at the heart, it's still about relationships and influence and people don't change. Even if the forms and the ways and the mechanisms that we accumulate influence have necessarily changed because we're not in the same room. And so, as has always been true, it is still true. The technical right answer will only take you so far. As with the Blockbuster case study and plenty of others, it's the coalitions of support, or worst case scenario, the absence of those coalitions, that's going to determine success or failure. And again, reams of research, and I'm sure people on this call has experience that can speak to that. And then finally, this misconception that political intelligence, how you strategically build influence, support, information, access, sponsorship, that this is a trait that only happens with and for some people and not for others. No. Look, of course it's going to happen more easily and come more easily to some people. But it is, like any skill, something that you can learn. If you understand quite how important this is, quite how important your access, your influence, your relationship currency, your social quotient, your power capital is. And if you understand how important it is, well, then you can start to lift your head up and understand where do you fit relative to it, and then relative to where you want to be, what do you need to do? And I love Esther Perel's work because, as with politics, as with life, as with the personal, so too with the professional. The quality of your relationships determines the quality of your life. And from a politics and power point of view, the quality of your relationships will strongly determine the quality of your career, the degree to which you can or can't make impact and further your career. And not just for your own sake. And I mean, I'm always stressing this, this is not just about you. This is about your team that needs you to deliver and be effective. This is about your stakeholders who are counting on you to be effective. This is always about something bigger than just you, because from a political player point of view, if it's all about you, well, then according to one of the models I share, well, then you're an out-and-out sociopath. And so assuming that you're not an out-and-out sociopath and that there is something bigger than just you that you're trying to focus on and things beyond just yourself that you're trying to achieve, well, then the people around you need you to be effective, and the relationships are the key thing in politics that will allow you to be effective or not. And so when I go through the range of skills that people who are politically intelligent have, it's always about relationships at the heart, about negotiation, about perspectives, about win-win, about understanding what matters to other people. And so with that, hopefully a couple of myths busted, even just at a very surface level. And so, I mean, if I start with House of Cards and then I move on to Game of Thrones, how can we finish anything about organizations and politics without moving to The Office? So some words of wisdom before we go into questions.
What is the most inspiring thing I ever said to you? Don't be an idiot. Changed my life. Whenever I'm about to do something, I think, would an idiot do that? And if they would, I do not do that thing.
So wise and deep and profound. But as somebody who is idiot number one, in such avoidable ways in my career, I implore you to please learn from my experiences. And if you want to learn more, there's a whole bunch of resources up on my website, freely available. A video, a workbook, videos, workbook. There's articles freely available. For heaven's sake, don't be an idiot. Don't fall into some of the traps and myths that I fell into around an either or, around integrity and values, or playing this game, playing in the informal, unofficial, behind the scenes space. Don't be an idiot and think that these things don't make a difference, not only to your career, but to the efficacy of the people who are counting on you. Don't be an idiot and think that this has gone away just because we're all doing this from our home. The form has changed, but the need to build relationships and social currency has not and never will, given who human beings are and how we work. And don't be an idiot and think, well, I'm an introvert or I'm an analytical kind of person. This is not my kind of thing. I'll just stick my head down and hope that my work speaks for itself. Work does not speak. People speak. And so who is speaking for you and what are they saying? This is all at the heart of power and politics. And you can use it ethically and to your benefit and the benefit of others, or you can continue to stick your head in the sand, and then the only thing that happens is a very vulnerable part of yourself is exposed, helping neither you nor anybody else. And so with that, questions, thoughts? Let's have a chat.
Niven, thanks very much. And the floor is open. Anyone who wants to either put a question on the chat box or just stick your hand up or just start asking a question, commenting. Anyone want to throw something into the pot? Okay, Niven, looks like I'm going to have to start.
Lovely. Well, let you and I just have a chat. Pete, it's been a while.
In your book, you point out that, as you've said today, it's not a question of whether organizations have politics, but what kind of politics they have. And then you use examples of energizing versus debilitating, hostile versus constructive, devastating versus creative, or destructive versus creative. And so I guess the question for me is, how do organizations go about ensuring that they get the right kind of culture, the positive culture, and not the destructive, debilitating, kind of culture that so often we've all experienced. How do you go about, what are the kind of ways that you would advocate to creating an energizing, constructive, creative kind of environment culture?
Yeah. Yeah, so isn't that a long question to think about? I suppose it boils down to a couple of things, Pete, for me, in my opinion and my experience having worked on culture change and having to embody cultures as the CEO of two organizations. I think the first is I've always believed very strongly as a leader, as an executive, as a manager, listen, leaders get the behaviors that they demonstrate and that they tolerate. I mean, it really does boil down to that. So what am I demonstrating and what am I tolerating from myself and from other people? And that long shadow that then gets cast by what I demonstrate and what I tolerate, sits firmly at my feet as somebody who is a custodian of the culture. And as we all are custodians of our culture at all levels, but particularly at senior levels. I think the second thing is, I often have I'm such a nerd, but I have long discussions around what culture is and isn't, and what strategy is and isn't. And for me, any idea that a mission statement or values are culture is inherently wrong. I mean, I think a mission statement and values are critical. They're foundational and necessary, but they're not in and of themselves sufficient. I mean, you have to look at the range of things in the system that give expression to the culture that you want and are coherent with your values or not. So what are some of those things? I mean, I've mentioned leadership behaviors. Somebody put on one of my LinkedIn posts, show me your heroes and I'll show you your culture. So what are those leadership behaviors that are spoken about, emulated, recognized, tolerated, or punished? What is your reward and recognition system? I mean, how many times have I seen complete dissonance in organizations? No, it's all about the ecosystem that we're trying to build, and we're all in this together, which strategically makes a whole bunch of sense and is exactly right, but your reward and recognition system focuses only on individual contributions. Now, I mean, any halfway thinking person is going to take their cue from what gets rewarded and recognized, not what's said in the strategy statement. What's the operating model and systems that people work with? I mean, I remember at Standard Bank, but it's not only Standard Bank, it could be any large organization. The value around agility and innovation and creativity. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely nothing wrong with that. And then you actually take yourself down from the 8th floor of Rosebank and go into a branch and sit with a teller. And she's sitting with 3 different screens and 5 different systems trying to give one answer to a customer. I mean, don't talk to me about creativity and innovation and agility when this is practically what she has to work with. 8 hours a day, every day, in and out. She can be as creative and innovative as she wants, but she can't give a customer an answer without looking across all these screens and systems because nothing works. So all of these things, I think, are around culture. And to simply proclaim with the best intentions, that sets the tone. But the real lived experience of what a culture is or isn't is in these range of things and the range of cues that either hopefully cohere and give a coherent story or are completely dissonant and completely at odds with each other.
Thank you. Questions? Steve?
Yeah, Niven, as usual, just a real treat to listen to you and to learn from you. It's been an extraordinary part of my journey along the way. Thank you so much, first of all. But secondly, I love the thought around politics disappear in a virtual world. And I'm very glad to see that it may well be a myth. I wanted to just twin that, though, with a fabulous statement you made about I'll let my work speak for myself. So I've seen a lot of that happening recently. People are saying, productivity is great, virtual's amazing, everyone's doing their work. And so work is speaking for itself. But as you rightfully pointed out, work does not speak. people speak. And are you seeing this challenged in a virtual world? Are people getting a chance to speak? Are they getting a chance to build their relationships as much as maybe they would have in a non-virtual world?
Yeah, so interestingly, Steve, I mean, I think there's been a lot of discussion and in some quarters, some incredibly strong pushback around this idea that everyone is more productive working from home. So where's some of the pushback come from? Well, first of all, people are saying, let's not underestimate the fear that people are having around the fact that they might lose their job. And so come what may, even if it's 16 hours a day, 18 hours a day, I'm going to work like crazy, because when everything is so uncertain and we're facing retrenchments and downsizing, if I'm the person who's sending emails at 2 o'clock at night in the morning, maybe I'm the one who is going to be okay when push comes to shove. And so the rise of anxiety, the rise of burnout, the rise of depression, cannot be ignored. And the causal correlation, whether it's a causative relationship or simply one of correlation, is one that a lot of people are asking about. It's like, hold on a second. How do we measure productivity, and what productivity at what cost? And we're not looking as deeply in that as we may necessarily need to. The second thing is, I mean, so much research around the disproportionate burden on women having to work from home now. And the second shift that needed to start for most women, not all women, but for many women, when they came home after a full day's work, is now way more interspersed every day, trying to hold down a job and look after the kids, and more men realizing. There was a fantastic article in The Guardian in the UK a few months ago, written by a man who said, if you'd asked me whether I was a 50-50 parent, like, absolutely. I mean, this is the 21st century. I'm an empowered man. Of course, I'm a 50-50 parent. And then he said he actually started to track and log, almost as one would with a timesheet. How much time do I spend with my kids? What are the things I'm doing with my kids day to day now, when my wife and I are both having to work from home? And then he repeated that experiment with friends of his. And he said he was deeply, deeply ashamed, because he said, his wife would have just given him what I call a screensaver expression every time he spoke about being a 50-50 parent. And then suddenly he thought, at best, I'm a 30% parent. My wife is picking up 70%, and it's getting even worse now at home. And I mean, I can see plenty of anecdotal evidence around that. And so I think, like I say, this question of productivity and where disproportionate burdens are falling and on whom, and why people are productive, and if they're productive, and at what cost they're being productive, is a big discussion. I think around the question of relationships, I mean, that's also an ongoing discussion. How do we build relationships? How do we build trust? And of course, you have the extremes as well. So on the one hand, a strong push, I don't trust people unless I can see them, which has been stretched and pushed and really given some opportunity to be thrown out as the archaic belief that it is. And yet, under stress, people are still regressing to that and saying, I need to have people around me. And by the same token, even very positive, constructive, healthy cultures, that sense of we're in it together, but we only feel like we're in it together when we can see each other. All of these things, I think, are playing out. And so a lot of questions, I think, a lot of research that still needs to happen, a lot of anecdotal evidence, but anecdotal evidence only sometimes to confirm a whole bunch of things that people already wanted to be true. So I don't know if that answers your question. I feel like I rambled a bit.
Thanks, Niven. Other questions, anybody?
Thank you, Niven. This is very generous lecture, and I'm wondering if you, when you come to a workplace that has a long trait of toxic culture, and in a workplace where there's a lot of hierarchies, and you come in and you want to change the culture, what are the ways that you find most successful in putting the boundaries into the behaviors that are accepted?
Yeah, so that's such an interesting question, Annalena, because, I mean, I can speak from experience here. So I think two things. First, I would distinguish between a toxic culture and a hierarchical culture, and they're not necessarily the same thing. So I've worked in two very hierarchical organizations, the Reserve Bank, the Central Bank of South Africa. I mean, I think it probably wrote the textbook for hierarchy and how it plays out. And then Standard Bank, which is the largest bank by assets in Africa, but is a very old established institution. So all kinds of stuff around hierarchy. And then I've only had, thank heavens, only one experience in my career of toxicity. And when I talk about the types of political environments in workshops, when it comes to truly toxic environments, my experience and all of the research says the same thing, that they're essentially akin to abusive relationships. And I say that quite seriously. And I mean, my experience of working for an out-and-out narcissist was unbelievably damaging to my sense of competence and confidence, my mental and physical and all kinds of other health. I mean, it was a really, really dreadful experience, which fortunately only lasted for 8 months. But I actually think that the effects lasted for much longer. And so a few years ago when I got cancer, it was my closest friend who, when I said this to her, and I mean, I have a history of cancer in my family and all kinds of stuff, but my closest friend, my dearest friend who'd gone through, years of life experiences with me as I have through her, her first response when I told her about the cancer was, "It was that bastard who did this to you." Now, I mean, she's not an oncologist. Like I say, I'm probably genetically predisposed. But the distress and the trauma that can go when you are in a truly toxic environment, I have heard echoed back in lectures now for years, with people talking about being shattered, being broken, losing their marriage, getting to a state where they had to go live with their parents for 6 months to try to recover. I mean, truly toxic environments, like I say, are like domestic abuse, and abusers don't change. And so my best advice, given very, very, very sincerely to people who are in a toxic environment, is to get out, because they're not going to change it. They can try to survive it, but psychopaths, and if you've read Snakes in Suits, you'll understand some of this stuff, are very unlikely to change. And they're very likely to have a long career because they're very good at making results happen, even over dead bodies. And they're very good at presenting a certain version of reality, one that favors them. So I say this just to separate out toxicity and hierarchy, because, like I say, they're not necessarily the same thing. But I think when it comes to culture change, what I've learned from some of the things that I've done wrong when I've been in charge of these projects, even working with very skilled consultants, is as much as possible to focus on what's right in a culture. And so the first culture change project that I was put in charge of, I'm like, this is not what I joined this company for. Like, how am I having to run culture change? Worked with a bunch of consultants who were brought in by EXCO. And they were very skilled, but with hindsight, I don't follow their approach anymore, because they were very much about showing what was wrong and trying to get people's attention and make it a burning platform for change. Actually, I don't think that works. Actually, I think it's about finding the things that do work and amplifying them and finding the energy and following it and knowing that, in the words of William Gibson, the science fiction writer, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So where are the pockets of energy? Where are the pockets of possibility? Where are the people who are just making things happen despite the constraints of the system? And how do you find them? And how do you amplify them? And I mean, you can do that through an organizational network analysis. You can do that through focus groups. You can do that through all manner of things. But I think in a place where there's possibility and a need for things to shift and change, starting with the positive and amplifying it is a far more powerful place to start. And then, all kinds of things around symbolic actions and looking at the things that mitigate against the change from a policies and procedure and reward and recognition point of view, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, these are multiple strands in a complex system that you can start to understand. So I hope that answers your question, or at least gives you some food for thought.
Yeah, thank you. What I'm thinking is that when you come to a new workplace, you kind of get the sense of the culture, and then people get involved and sucked into the culture. And sometimes the culture is inherited from the people who are no longer even working in the workplace, and they have such a long tail. And shifting that, and I found in one of the Brené Brown's podcasts of Death Lead podcast, I think it was, she said that one social worker that shifted to doing artwork and having art classes found that some of her art students started to copy her work, and then they started to selling it online. And what she then did was she said that here's what is okay. It's okay that you paint like I do and put it on your wall. What is not okay is that you paint like I do and put it your name underneath it and sell it as your work. And she said that was an important understanding, that you state what's okay and then you state what is not okay. And I think that doing both of these, you kind of set boundaries for the bad behaviors that are no longer acceptable.
Yes, no, I remember that post, in fact, and she speaks about this friend of hers as exemplary in a very generous way, but also a very clear way.
Yeah.
Look, I violently agree.
Okay.
That even people who aren't there, the shadow that their leadership cast can be felt for years afterwards.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that when I've worked with groups and you've unpacked, but where does this come from? I mean, sometimes those people aren't even alive anymore, much less in the but the learned behavior in the face of their leadership, good grief, it's still there. And so these are the fascinating things to unpack, I think, in multiple ways.
Thank you.
Niven, I've got a question.
Yes.
And also, I know you, Finn, you've got your hand up, but go for it. Whoever's asking the question.
Mary Rose.
Mary Rose, go for it.
Thank you so much. For people who are historically bad at playing the game and are still in the same spot, do you have any advice for those people to try and like dial it back, or what do you call it, like do some repairing?
So repairing, or how they start to show up differently, even if there's nothing that needs to be repaired, they just want to show up better.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're historically bad at playing the game and you've like made some faux pas or whatever, and it's sort of like made things difficult for you in the workplace.
Yeah. Look, so I mean, I think it depends on the nature and the context of the faux pas, right? I mean, the reality is we're all going to stuff up somewhere, and sometimes more than once, in fact, often more than once. And Winston Churchill said it well. In war, you can only be killed once. In politics, you can be killed many times. And so there are some things that you're going to struggle to come back from. And then for all other things, there's just practice and getting better. And so the short answer, because I don't know how serious your faux pas might be, but the short answer is, I always say in lectures, there's three things. First of all, awareness. So if you suddenly are, through my work, hopefully made aware of some of your blind spots, some of the things that you didn't understand that you need to and want to, well, that's a great place to start. Then from awareness, go to assessment. And if you go to my website, there's a whole bunch of free stuff that you can download, a workbook that you can work through. And so assess yourself, like, where am I relative to where I want to be? And what then, to finish off the workbook, is your political strategy going to need to be based on the context that you're currently in, which is going to be very different for everybody, obviously. And then from there, it's action, and it's ongoing action for the rest of your career. So assuming and hoping that the situation is not irreparable, where might you start? And the political strategy exercise gives you some pointers as to where to start, having worked through a whole bunch of exercises.
Thanks, Niven. Hugh?
Yeah, Niven, thanks for a tremendous amount of wisdom that's come from all of your experience. And one thing that just resonated with me a moment ago was concentrate on what your strengths are and grow them. And a book I read recently was Barefoot Coach by Paddy Upton. I don't know if you've come across it, but he with Gary Kirsten in coaching the Indian side, two things came out there. And one of them was that, really look to see what the player's strength is and don't try and focus on their weaknesses, because it's their strengths that have got them into the national team. So, that's what they did and went on to have great success. And the other thing that really struck me was when Kirsten was first appointed, and Tendulkar was one of the players that was now in his team, the world's best player, arguably. And so Gary Kirsten said to him, what do you want from me? And all Tendulkar replied was that I want a friend, which I think speaks volumes. Thank you.
That's a lovely story. I've heard of the book. I haven't had a chance to read it, but now that really intrigues me. So thank you.
Well, our time is up, but Niven, thank you. It's been a fantastic hour, and thank you for all that you are doing and will continue to do in so many organizations and the work you do. It's appreciated by many. And